Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marcus Engel, and this is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. And today I am super excited to introduce to you Dr. Richard I. Levin, who is the CEO and president of the Gold Humanism Honor Society. And Rich, thank you so much for being with me today. I have a lot of ground I want to cover with you. But thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, it's just a pleasure to be here having this conversation, Marcus. And if I can begin by clearing up just a very small statement that you just made. The Gold Foundation is the parent organization, and it is that of which I'm president and CEO. And the Gold Humanism Honor Society is one of our great signature programs.
Gotcha. Excellent. Excellent. So as the CEO of the Gold Foundation, tell people who have not got the familiarity of maybe what the Gold Foundation does. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of where the organization comes from and how it supports compassion and humanity in healthcare?
Sure. Let's begin around 460 BC on the island of Kos in the Aegean. It was the time, theoretically, when Hippocrates roamed the island and invented the concepts of Western medicine long before there was anything to base it on science, long before that existed. And over many years, over 2 millennia, the basis in the facts of science became the real driving force of medicine. As we approached the genomic age, as we came to expect that in very short order, years, once the genome sequence had been figured out, we would have a different kind of medicine to practice. And the advent of the computerized medical record, the growing corporatization of hospital acute care, all contributed to a physical and metaphorical distancing between the doctor or the clinician and the patient. And in the 80s, it came to the point where the traditional rounds, the opportunity for the whole healthcare team, including students of many varieties, would go to the bedside of the patient, and the attending physician, the most senior person on the team, who we hoped was wise and compassionate, would often sit on the bed and hold the hand of a patient in trouble and have a conversation which demonstrated how, in a moment of extraordinary crisis, of acute anxiety over survival, potentially, you could speak in a way that gave comfort. And in the 80s, we stopped rounding in the bed, at the bedside. We moved the whole conversation outside the room. Now, often it took place right in front of the patient so that the patient could see and hear our discussion. But the focus became the movable screen, the computer, where someone would type in the attending suggestions and plans, make new plans for the patient for that day. There was a wonderful, world-renowned pediatric neurologist named Arnold Gold, at the time a professor of pediatric neurology at Columbia University, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, now called Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. And he had the way, he had the knack. He understood almost intuitively how to speak to the patient, his young patients and their families, in the way that Hippocrates hoped might happen. And he saw this happening. He saw this distancing, which was building, getting worse over the period, let's say, from post-World War II up into the 80s, and decided with his wife, Sandra, an educator, that they would create a foundation to elevate the clinicians, all the members of the healthcare team, initially focused on doctors in their education in medical school, and subsequently expanded to touch all of the health professions, and make certain that people remembered, students remembered, that regardless of how miraculous the technology became, that their jobs, our jobs, were to use that technology best, but never forget that medicine and the practice of medicine is fundamentally a human interaction, and being able to make the connection with the patient was fundamental to healing. And that was the beginning, and the foundation was created in 1988, so it's approaching 35 years old, and in that time has had, because of the passion and persistence of the founders and wonderful people who took up this cause of a social movement that we hope would become first national and then global, has grown dramatically in these 35 years.
So it seems kind of unbalanced that we go back to 2,500 years ago, and then somehow we lost connection along the way up until the 1980s, when there was such a need. I think you're saying that there was such a need for bringing us back to that time of Hippocrates, to simply understand how valuable that relationship between two human beings is in the delivery of medicine. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes. We can shorten the story by looking just at the change in modern practice. As short a time ago as the 1950s, medicine was largely a community practice. Doctors were of a community, often among its most respected members. They practiced by the classic rules of maintaining absolute security of the patient's record and remarks, their medical history. And it was a time when doctors became doctors, expecting to practice with autonomy, and often as individual practitioners, solo practices. And between 1950 and now, 75 years approximately, doctors have gone from being employees 25% of the time to being employees almost 80% of the time. That is, employed by a health system or a hospital system that takes care of all of the administrative responsibility of caring for patients, but has changed fundamentally many things about the relationship. And it's been these 75 years in which the forgetting, the loss that you just described of that two millennial tradition occurred most acutely.
And so this started to change in the 80s when Well, I'm sure since the beginning of time and since the beginning of the complications of healthcare in America, the hugely expanding role of healthcare in America, as those things got more complicated, it gets harder to move away. It becomes harder to move away from that. That, as you said, the fundamental human experience, but I feel like those who choose to practice medicine or choose to work in healthcare, they usually do have that very compassionate heart that they want to help people. And yet we find ourselves in modern day healthcare, things being so complex and revenue and survey scores and such like that, that people don't, as you said, have the autonomy anymore to practice like they really want to. And that's, I guess, where the Gold Foundation really steps in to try to keep humanism at the heart of medicine, right?
Yeah. In fact, the logo of the Gold Foundation is keeping healthcare human. That's precisely what you just described. That is our goal. And it's important to recognize, Marcus, that humans love binary distinctions. We love to dichotomize black and white. It is either that or that. Democrats, Republicans, red states, blue states, it's easier just to have the two categorizations of any philosophical or social construct. That we are trying to keep healthcare human in no way casts a doubt on the miraculous development of technology, of immunizations, which have made the practice of medicine and the likelihood of a long life of health during that lifetime so much greater. It is the weaving together of technology and humanistic concepts, the centrality of humans, their ideas, their interests, and their dignity of all peoples that we try and stress as the co-equal driving force of optimal healthcare.
Yeah, I love that. And so before you were a doctor, when you were considering going into medicine, have you always had this at your personal heart, or who was your example to have this type of empathetic mindset towards all humanity that I assume took you to med school in the first place, right?
Yeah. I've pondered that question. I've been asked that question before. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I'll tell you that my dad was a small town practitioner. I grew up in Freehold, New Jersey, the county seat of Monmouth County, where we had Molly Pitcher's Well, and where the Battle of Monmouth was fought in the Revolutionary War. And it was a small town, largely populated by chicken farms in the periphery. Many immigrants were present, but there was a core group of just a couple of doctors. My dad had his office in our house on Main Street, which was a white Victorian thing with a picket fence around it. And while he returned from World War II, where he served as a physician in the military in Europe, the Eighth Army, he came back quite changed by the stories of the family who knew him best, and was very quiet. And it took me the rest of his lifetime to discover that quiet didn't actually describe how he interacted with his patients. He had a wonderful reputation, and they loved him deeply because he managed, I guess, he managed to have the ability to provide care without being overly patriarchal, being a figure who commanded. He was a true collaborator, and that collaboration between him and his patients is one of the three elements that we use to characterize what humanism in healthcare is. Compassion, collaboration, and scientific excellence, and all three have to be there. And the word collaboration refers to that practice of engaging the patient as a co-equal in the process of figuring out what the course of therapy will be, how to cure, how to best provide an approach when neither technology nor therapies can provide the entire answer in particular. So I knew some of that, Marcus. I think I've invented part of that personal mythology over the years, but I knew some of it, and I knew without thinking about it that I wanted to be a doctor from a very early age. And there were events that occurred as a medical student that convinced me I was heading in the right direction, that I had made the right choice.
And that seems like a perfect lead-in to a question that I ask almost all of my guests, and this is also the first writing assignments that my pre-meds at Notre Dame get every semester, and that is to talk about a time or write about a time that is the foundation of compassion and empathy, and that is write about a time that someone was there for you or that you were there for someone else. And I have to imagine that growing up in a home that was also doubling as a doctor's office and throughout personal life and medicine, you've had many, many, many opportunities to provide that compassionate care and also receive that kind of compassion. Is there a story that really jumps to mind when I say a time that you were there for someone or that they were there for you?
Yeah. A lot of them, but I'll tell you one that represents that moment on the journey, the transition from becoming a student to medical student to doctor. I was in my third year. I was doing my rotations, my clinical rotations after studying the 2 years learning the science of medicine, or being introduced to the science of medicine. And I was on my internal medicine rotation. And one of the reasons that I chose NYU as a school to attend was not only its extraordinary reputation, but because it was affiliated with Bellevue Hospital, the oldest public hospital in the United States. And I had heard many stories along the way about what it meant to train in a public hospital. There were many great such hospitals at the beginning of the 20th century, and now almost none have survived. Bellevue's still there, Grady in Atlanta, Mass General up in Boston began as a public hospital, the California system as well. So it was my third year. I was in my element. I had been waiting to do this job of interacting with patients. It was, as you described at the very beginning of our conversation, a calling for me. And I was on call, and when you're on call as a medical student, you help the residents and attending physicians take care of the patients who are admitted to the hospital on that day. So by chance, I was in the rotation to receive the next patient when a man who appeared to be in his 60s or 70s, gray-haired, a handsome guy, was wheeled into the emergency room very quiet, sweating, perhaps pale. And those are among the classic signs of recognition of someone having a heart attack. It turned out that he was the chief international pilot for the then Pan American Airways, kind of the leading American fleet of airliners, made a lot of records in opening up foreign countries when a flight just began. And he was on his layover, woke up, developed severe chest pain, some lightheadedness, and they brought him to Bellevue, which was a common thing to do. He was having a massive heart attack, and there were many doctors around, and I was the medical student, and I got a chance to speak to him in those first few hours when, at those times, we did not understand the pathophysiology. We didn't understand that a clot had formed in one of the arteries supplying his heart with blood, and that we needed to break that clot in order to reestablish blood flow and oxygen. And the course of therapy was really to hold their hands for up to 6 weeks in the hospital if it was a bad attack. He developed a condition called cardiogenic shock. His heart could not pump adequately to maintain blood pressure to the critical organs, and he was, with that diagnosis, he had a 95% chance of dying. In the few hours after he was admitted, somehow he and I made a deep connection. And he trusted me even though I was a third-year medical student, and announced that I was only a student as part of our conversation when I was taking his history. And we had to make a decision about using a therapy which had just become useful and not a research tool, which was an aortic balloon pump. We added a pump to his heart's ability to pump by inserting this device into his aorta, the large artery that supplies the whole body with blood. And he knew in making the decision to let us do that, that device alone could cause severe complication, including loss of limbs and strokes and all manner of difficult things. But he trusted us, he trusted me, and the use of that emergency procedure contributed to the fact that he wasn't one of the 5%, the 95% who died. He survived, and he was in the hospital for about 6 weeks through a course of mild rehabilitation, mostly in that bed, and I visited him every day for much longer than busy hospital doctors and students are. And it was that convinced me that not only was it a noble profession, it was worth the respect that society gave it, but it was a means to achieve a depth of connection and an understanding about human nature that was just a privilege to to be part of.
And that's a beautiful story.
That's the
story.
Yeah.
And I love that you said a beauty and a depth of human nature, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So how does the Gold Foundation help foster these types of interactions and relationships between providers and patients?
Yeah, in sort of every way we can, with rituals, with recognition of exemplars of humanism in healthcare, by doing research and role modeling, the 4 R's that Sandra Gold, as an anthropologist, educator, brought to the foundation. So the foundation invented the white coat ceremony, which many people know of because it has become one of the most moving and popular elements of higher education in the United States and beyond. And that began in 1993 at just a few medical schools and hospitals, starting at Arnold Gold's own position at Columbia, and Rutgers and UMDNJ, and several places that wanted to experiment with this, because it was a time when research being done to find cures, to move into molecular medicine, was at its height. And to focus on humanism and the human connection by doing a ceremony to create a line between the wonderful educational careers that students had up until that point, the things that they had accomplished in the U.S. and globally, were fundamentally different from the awesome responsibility of taking care of a patient in absolute security that the interactions would be confidential, that the responsibility was of a magnitude that they anticipated, but about which they were going to be potentially separated for a couple of years that while they learned the science of medicine. And Arnold recognized that taking the Hippocratic Oath at the end of medical school was a mistake as schools began to engage students in dealing directly with patients from the day they arrive at medical school. And so he asked the schools to move that ceremony to the beginning of their medical educations, allow them to be cloaked in the white coat, not as a symbol of elitism, but rather as their moment of being drawn into this profession and making certain, validating their call to come into the profession to be of help, to heal, etc. So the white coat ceremony was one of the first things we did in the invention of what you mentioned at the outset, Marcus. The Gold Humanism Honor Society was a new organization invented in 2002 that now engages, calls as members 45,000 MD and DO, doctor of osteopathy graduates in the United States and 11 foreign countries. There are 180 chapters worldwide, and there are 45,000 docs who are members who were selected by their peers as exemplifying the characteristics that they would want in their doctors, that they would want in the doctors caring for their family members, having that ability to make the connection. And it was recognized after after lobbying for 20 years, it was recognized in 2015 as being as important, in part because of the peer recognition and in part because of the characteristic of re-merging the elements of scientific excellence and humanism in the individual student. And it was recognized as an element of the electronic residency application, which is the uniform way that people move on from medical school to their residencies and the rest of their lives as doctors. And those two examples are recognition rituals that allow people for a moment in their very busy lives and course to recognize that the elements of being a good doctor are not just knowing the science, but being able to use that science for the creation of optimal health care.
So I first became acquainted with the Gold Foundation probably maybe 10 years ago because of the white coat ceremonies that had moved from graduation from medical school also into graduation from nursing school.
Yes.
And I was invited to keynote for a white coat ceremony at St. Louis University with their graduating nurses, and I loved being part of that. And I guess I'm kind of curious when you talk about the white coat ceremony coming about in '93. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was done to provide docs with their white coats prior to that? Was it just like, here's a white coat, go put it on, or was there any type of as you said, ceremony or ritual to the process?
Yeah. So when I got to NYU in August of 1970, we were given a locker in a basement hallway and a mailbox. And when I opened that mailbox, there was a torn little slip of paper, literally. And it said, report to such and such a room in Bellevue Hospital on this date at this time for your measurements for your white coat and pants. Because in those days, our uniform was all white, both the coat and the pants. Neither of which actually fit anybody correctly. But I walked over at the appointed hour. There was a room filled with these uniforms, and there was a seamstress at the back of the room. She looked up over her glasses and said, come on in, Doc. And I walked in. She said, I guess you're here for your white coat, aren't you? And I said yes. And she gave me my ceremony. She took some measurements. She said, you come back in a week and I'll have your stuff ready for you. But before she let me go, she said, now listen here. You take care of our patients. You do a good job, Doc. That's the only thing I'm asking you. And it was a wonderful moment for me. It was my ceremony. I don't know if she did that for every medical student, but it was before '93 when the Gold Foundation invented it. There was no ceremony. It was just a rite of simple passage. I'll tell you where in that thing, the first days when you're with patients is a real kick. It's a high. But there was no ceremony. But
yet the tailor, the seamstress, who was of course a human, recognized that this was at least a outward expression that a page had been turned, maybe a chapter had been completed, however, whatever metaphor that you would like with that. And even her just saying, go out and do good, be a good doctor. That's a powerful story.
It was powerful story. It was amazing, and I've used it when I, like you, have been asked to officiate or keynote some of these white coat ceremonies. But it also focuses on something equally important, which the trustees of the foundation and I recognized when I arrived to be president in 2012, and that is that the focus on undergraduate medical MD education was entirely appropriate for the moment of inventing the foundation. But now, given our concept of optimal care being a team exercise, having a healthcare team with more than one clinician potentially on the team, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, social workers, anyone who was needed to provide not only the medical care, but the socioeconomic support that might be necessary to bring everyone up to that same level of recognition and to make everyone have available that care, it became important to engage the nurses who traditionally had a reputation of being the compassionate service within healthcare, that we ought to mark that moment of entering nursing school in a similar way and move then with doctors and nurses being able to recognize that moment and the importance of humanism and the human connection, then to move out to pharmacists and all the other what used to be called allied health professions, all the groups who make up the modern healthcare team, whether it's acute care setting in the hospital or ambulatory care or primary care, etc. And so the foundation has been able in this last decade to move from focusing on doctors alone to all the members of the healthcare team. And that job is underway. I mean, we haven't been yet as fully successful as we will be in another 25 years.
I love that, because I think we all know that most patients in acute care spend more time around their nurses and their CNAs and other therapists than they do sometimes around their doctors. And so I love that you're taking that inclusive view that this is a team, right? This is a team effort, that we're all working together to make sure that patient has the best healing experience that they can. And how else do you do that other than appeal to that common tie of individual humanity?
Yeah, I think that's right and important, and speaks directly to, one of the difficulties of the moment in organized health care in America, which is that in the absence of a single payer system or a unification in the requirements for every system, we've moved into a time when the litigiousness and the mistrust between the professions, among the caring professions, and the administration of healthcare, virtually every component has moved in this remarkable period of the last 5 years to a heightened mistrust, a questioning of whether the doctor, the nurse, the hospital, the system, public care, public health can be trusted. And it's really, I think, through emphasizing humanism and that collaborative essence in medicine that we can get back to repairing this problem.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that there are organizations like the Gold Foundation that are doing this work in such a formal way. Um, just beautiful stuff there. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah. So I've been trying to change my vocabulary a little bit because I do believe that words are important, and oftentimes near the end of interviews, I throw out what I call rapid fire questions. But I believe that maybe I should change my vocabulary and say instead of rapid fire, just I don't know what's another good term, random questions. How's random questions for you? So I have a couple of random questions for you.
Okay.
And number one is let's think back to the time that you were 16 years old. You're hanging out with your high school friends after school, study time, or weekends. When you're 16 years old and you're driving around or hanging out at somebody's house, what are you listening to? What's the music that's on the radio or on the record player, etc.?
Rock and roll.
Okay.
It was, well before the Beatles arrived, but it was that wonderful Detroit sound interpreted in 1,000 ways. It was, it just seemed to complement the discovery of the opposite sex and all that life held ahead.
And it must have been in the water because there's someone else awfully famous from Freehold, New Jersey, who took that to a great extent. And if anyone knows me, they know my deep love for Bruce Springsteen and his music. And so it almost made me want to ask the question: did your dad ever treat any of the Springsteen family in Freehold?
If he did, I didn't know about it.
You didn't
then.
know about it because of the absolute security and confidentiality.
Yeah, I think my dad had already died when Bruce hit the scene, when the boss started doing his thing. But so that's the modern equivalent of Molly Pitcher's Well. That's the other thing that made Freehold really famous.
Excellent. So another question for you is, if you were stranded on the proverbial desert island, but this is a well-equipped desert island where you could keep one piece of art with you, and whether that art is a painting, a book, an album, maybe a Broadway play, what would you keep with you? Or I guess another way to ask that question is, what is a piece of art that really speaks to who you are?
Until you said speaks to who you are, I had an idea in my head. I'll use it anyway.
Sure.
And it's Les Mis. And I saw the Broadway production around the time of it was for the 40th anniversary of my wedding to my girlfriend, whom I met on the beach at the Jersey Shore, not far from Freehold. And Les Mis seemed to speak to something so vital, so internal, soulful about the struggles that we all have for justice, for living our lives without so many encumbrances, rules and regulations, that there was an order of humanity, and the music was so spectacular. And if you haven't listened to it, Marcus, the album of I think it was the 25th anniversary of Les Mis, which had all the casts of the major productions in Australia and Great Britain and the United States at the time, and they took over a huge auditorium, amphitheater, and every time they sang a song, the entire audience was on its feet, because it wasn't just the cast and the chorus. It was hundreds of singers and those great voices. So yeah,
what
Les
a
Mis.
powerful experience, right?
Yeah.
To be able to, I always love that collective experience in music. And you usually think about it at rock concerts with everybody fists in the air, pumping and dancing. But when you're talking about Broadway, that also is powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a thing that, was at risk for disappearing because of the pandemic. All of Broadway closed. We have not gotten back to the way it was before. And while everything may have changed, that ability to create shows like that, Phantom of the Opera, all of the great musicals. Yeah.
I'm really big into singer-songwriters, as you can probably expect, and lyrics. And I always think back on the line from in Les Mis, to love another person is to see the face of God. And I think that so well relates to our work in humanism and compassion and humanity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess for my last question then is, if you had the world's largest billboard on the highest mountain, what is the message that you would like to impart to humanity?
What a great question. I guess that all human beings have a fundamental right not only to health care, but to humanistic practiced health care, in which science provides the truth and compassion speaks that truth to the heart.
Compassion speaks that truth to the heart. It's a beautiful line. It's a beautiful line. Dr. Levin, thank you so much for being with me today. This has been wonderful. Thank you for taking time out of your day and sharing about your work and the work of the Gold Foundation. And we will, of course, put links to the Gold Foundation site in the show notes. And please, listeners, if you are part of a nursing program, or as we talked about the allied health programs, please reach out to the Gold Foundation to discover how we can impart more of this humanism into students that are going to be taking care of all of us in the next generation. So Dr. Levin, thank you so much for being with me. And everyone, we will see you next time on the next episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. As always, I'm your host, Marcus Engel. This is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. Thank you.